Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm very excited for this discussion. The title of today's webinar is the Atlassian Cloud Survival Guide. My name is Andy Fernandez. I'm the Senior Director of Product Marketing here at HYCU, and I'm joined by Nick Wade, co-founder and COO of Opus Guard. The conversation that we're having today came from recent announcements of Atlassian informing customers and everyone in the community that data center will be end of life very soon. So the conversation we're going to have today is both from a compliance and a data protection and a security conversation to help you understand, well, I have to move. What do I need to do to make sure that I'm moving safely, effectively, and with full control of my data now that you know that you do have to move to the cloud? Before we get started, this presentation will be available to you on demand. You are going to get access to the slides as well. If you have any questions, please leverage the chat and we will make sure to answer them throughout the session and respond to you immediately. If we get too many questions, we'll make sure to send you an email as well. But for those who are just joining us now, today's focus I'm very excited about is the Atlassian Cloud Survival Guide. You already know me, you've seen me before. I'm on the HYCU team here on the product side. But Nick, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure thing. Thanks, Andy. Nick Wade here, co-founder and COO at Opus Guard. And glad to be with you. Thanks for the invite. Happy to be with you again, Andy, talking about what to do when thinking about migrating to Atlassian Cloud now that we're all going to have to. And so there's a ton of things that we can probably regularly predict and forecast. And then there's some things that we'll uncover in this webinar together that you might not be thinking about as you contemplate that migration. Quick bit on my background. I worked at Atlassian for a number of years on the ecosystem and marketplace business. And I've also built a couple of other ecosystem business platforms at DigitalOcean and Auth0 and Okta since then. And my co-founders and I started Opus Guard last year to go about the business of simplifying information governance as more and more of our applications at work move across to the cloud. And the challenges associated with information governance get more complicated and multiply there.
Very excited to have you, Nick. I think you bring an interesting perspective, especially in the compliance side. So we want you to walk away from today's session really understanding what is your responsibility, what are some of the mistakes that we've observed in the past, how to make sure you don't make those as you're moving. And we're going to get right into the agenda. So a couple of things that we're going to talk about is, Atlassian is not the only cloud service that you'll be leveraging in your organization. We've seen this before, whether it's Microsoft, whether it's Salesforce, whether it's GitHub or any other service. We're going to share some research with you, some best practices, but most importantly, what are some of the most common mistakes that we see when somebody is moving to the cloud, especially when they're moving much faster than they anticipated from a server or data center hosted application to an as a service model. We're also going to talk about the most important thing today, which is actually this massive misconception of responsibility. What does that mean in an application like Atlassian or a platform like Atlassian? And we're going to decode exactly what Atlassian's version of the shared responsibility model is. From there, I'm going to share some very, very specific requirements that you're going to need to have in order to leverage data protection and meet your data protection requirements in a cloud deployment. Nick's going to do the same thing from the data governance side. But first, I want to talk to you a little bit about how we even got here. And the reality is that if we go back 20 years ago, many of us were still in the IT organization. Maybe other folks were still in college or high school or even middle school. But the reality is 20 years ago, organizations had all of their applications at a data center. Every single business application production system was running in their data center. For better or for worse, if you were in IT at that time, you were the king or queen of that castle. You can go and essentially manage and touch these critical workloads that you were protecting. But if you go about 10 years ago, you started to see the first enterprise SaaS applications come out, whether it was Salesforce or Microsoft at the time. And you started to see the first use cases for public cloud services as well, mostly for data storage and a couple other ancillary use cases. But still, everything was in your data center. If you go back 5 years ago, you started to see a lot more SaaS applications, and the cloud started to really mature. You started to see folks not only actually leveraging for storage or as a DR target, but potentially even thinking about running production in the cloud, lifting and shifting in the cloud. But still, primary production workloads were in the data center. Today, it's a lot trickier to kind of determine where organizations are. But what we know is that there's still going to be a data center footprint, but it won't be for business applications like Atlassian or Salesforce or Microsoft. All of those applications are going to be consumed as a SaaS. So your virtual workloads, your physical workloads will be in data center. You're most likely leveraging production workloads in cloud. and leveraging even for ML AI use cases. But every single business application that your organization uses is as a service. And Atlassian might even be one of the last applications that you still have hosted in your data center that is no longer going to be available. So what I want to focus on now is not only what we've observed, we've had hundreds of conversations with customers who have made this move, not only in Atlassian, but in other applications as well. And we want to share some of the research that we have and some of the common mistakes that we see and how to help you avoid making those mistakes in your organization. So a couple months ago, we went out and spoke to leverage an organization to go and speak to over 500 IT pros. And we asked them a ton of questions around their SaaS usage. And one of the things that we noticed was, first of all, per second, zoom out of just the Atlassian ecosystem. Your organization, whether it's in the Atlassian system of work or outside of it, is leveraging hundreds of SaaS applications already. Now, in the survey that we did, we interviewed mid-market organizations all the way to the enterprise. And the mean average there was 139 SaaS applications. But Nick, you've sourced data before that was more on the enterprise side. What kind of numbers have you observed on your end with how many SaaS applications could be running in an organization?
Yeah, Andy, we've spent time looking through data compiled and collated by other organizations using similar survey techniques. And what they have found in 2024 is that enterprise organizations often have upwards of 350 SaaS applications in use at any one time. Now, there's a theory today that number is going to shrink a little bit as cloud and SaaS governance strategies are employed at more and more companies, and we get a handle on what people have been calling shadow IT, or at least a better handle on it. But the reality is, a lot of teams have some self-direction and some self-guidance in terms of what they choose to use and some budget in order to do it. And so this number is not unusual or unreasonable in today's enterprise companies.
Absolutely. And if you're joining us today as an Atlassian admin or architect, you may be encountering this problem for the first time. But if you're joining us as somebody with an IT who's still going to be responsible for the migration, you've seen this before. And what I want to share too, though, is what are some of the pitfalls of this? The first one is the cost of security incidents. And this one was very shocking to me, Nick, to see some of the data. But when we ask these IT pros, folks who are managing significant amount of SaaS applications, we ask them, have you experienced a data breach this year of your SaaS applications? 65% of them did so. 87% of those experienced some form of disruption. Nick, that disruption period was over across 5 working days with an average cost of $400K per day. This doesn't immediately mean that that's going to be the cost of Atlassian or that you're going to have a breach or an incident in Atlassian. What it just shows you is that without the proper planning, without really understanding how to protect, how to maintain compliance in your SaaS applications, there are significant challenges and consequences to that. So it's very, very important to make sure that you go in with your eyes wide open and have a full awareness of your responsibility. And the reason I say that is because these same organizations that experience breaches, these same organizations that were losing hundreds of thousands of dollars per day in extended disruption periods were completely underprotected and underprepared. Nick, I'm sure you have so many anecdotes even on the governance and on the compliance side. But when it comes to the backup side, only less than a third of them were actually performing backups, policy-driven backups. Less than a third were actually storing this data offsite, which is just a basic fundamental requirement. And less than a quarter of them were actually performing some form of resilience tests. So what it's showing here is that there are a lot of SaaS applications. Atlassian is not the only one. It will not be the only one. Security incidents do happen, and you have to be aware of that. But organizations are very, very unprepared. And Nick, I'll test a theory on you, but it's something that we're observing, because what we're observing, and the data shows this, is there's a massive lack of visibility, but especially a lack of ownership into who owns this. And the reason I believe this, Nick, is potentially in the organization, when you're on Atlassian Data Center or even on server, you have an IT manager, an IT group who has been taking backups of all virtual and physical infrastructure. It's all uniform, so all the backups go there. And you can check the list that, hey, this has been backed up today. It's stored in a storage appliance offsite or somewhere else, and potentially even on tape. The moment that that application leaves a data center footprint and goes to somebody else's environment, aka the cloud, all of a sudden, maybe the Atlassian admin and that group now owns backups. And That's not the day-to-day of an organization to manage backups if you're actually just responsible for the Atlassian deployment. Nick, what have you observed maybe in the context of compliance around this?
Yeah, sure thing. So we've seen many cases, Andy, in our travels while researching what Opus Guard can help customers with. The first big thing is that customers could take snapshots of databases, restore their own servers, and do whatever they want with those snapshots at any given point in time and do it within a certain time window. And so that could include restoration in case of a service outage of an internal application. That could include cleaning data out based on compliance with data retention mandates that organization faces. But now, once migrated over to a vendor's SaaS tools, you're at the mercy of the APIs or other native tools that they give you for all of those things. And so that's why companies like HYCU and Opus Guard exist, in order to help solve those problems for more customers.
Very well put, Nick. One of the things that we've observed too, and the data shows this, is here's where we lie into the crux of the matter. It's this misconception that, and it's very human, right? When you're responsible to host an application like Jira on a data center, you're responsible for deploying it, you're responsible for patching, for maintaining, or updating when there are CVEs. You're responsible for the entire life cycle of that application alongside all of your other systems and applications. But when you go to cloud, something happens in all of our minds that think, well, it's in somebody else's infrastructure. They're managing that infrastructure. They're probably going to do everything they need to do from a security, from a compliance, and a backup perspective. So regardless of how many SaaS applications they stated and how many security incidents there were, Nick, 66% think responsibility for data protection should lie with their vendor. What's your reaction to that, Nick? Does that match with the behavior you've observed?
That doesn't match with what we observe in practice, Andy, as you well know. And so we're going to bleed or lead into this notion of a shared responsibility model that every customer of any SaaS vendor needs to know about. Now, Atlassian have been kind enough to publish their thoughts on what that shared responsibility model looks like. And so we're going to walk you through some of that now.
Absolutely. When we see successful migrations without disruption, without security incidents, without further reviews, is because an organization has a full accounting of Atlassian share in all of this from an infrastructure perspective and the customer share. So we're going to dive right into, as you mentioned, Atlassian has documented all of this. They have done a great job of explaining exactly what they're going to do and exactly what you need to do within your organization as well. So when we look at decoding this a little bit, the best example we can provide is the one of a parking garage. And by the way, this shared responsibility model that Atlassian has is the same exact model that is used across every cloud platform and across every SaaS application. For example, I'm showing you Azure's here, but AWS, Google Cloud, everyone leverages the same model. And it's the same thing as a parking garage. If Nick and I go somewhere and we park our vehicle in the garage, what are the expectations? That we can pay for the service, that the lights are on, that you can park, that the garage is still there, and when we come back, that the car is still there. But if Nick leaves the window open and my laptop is stolen, first of all, I'll never forgive him. But second of all, the garage is not going to pay me for that laptop. They'll say, well, it's your responsibility for the contents of your vehicle. You left the door open. It's common sense. Why would we have to pay for that? So the garage takes no liability for that. Any cloud provider, including Atlassian, is going to be the same. If somebody dents the car, if there's an accident, you need to have insurance. You have to take responsibility for that. The same principles apply to the cloud. If there is a massive attack on Atlassian's infrastructure, they have the tools and they have the responsibility to manage that. If you have password, and every organization has access to a written password somewhere and somebody enters your environment, that's not on Atlassian. How could they possibly stop that? How could they possibly stop user error? So that's where understanding exactly what your responsibility is so important. Nick, does that analogy make sense to you? Are there other ways that you help people really understand and differentiate what they're responsible for?
Yeah, Andy, first, let me apologize for leaving the car unlocked, but also mention that, as you know, in modern day cities, the window would probably get broken. So maybe you shouldn't leave your laptop in the car in future.
Fair.
No, I think this is a pretty good analogy that we have some responsibility to also take care of being prepared for what's going to happen so that regardless of whether or not Atlassian's site infrastructure gets into an outage and they restore it, that we also have, for example, a copy of the data protected and also abilities to remove it when it's time for that to happen.
Well put, Nick. That makes sense to me. So let's actually now dive in. And as discussed in the agenda, we're going to talk about data protection and cyber resilience, and we're going to talk about governance and data retention. Let's go into the data protection side first. Once again, here are fundamental things that you're going to be responsible for. And it doesn't matter if you choose HYCU, if you choose another vendor, if you decide to kind of try and build this yourself, it doesn't matter. These are all things that you have to have. The first one, you have to have automated backups. What I mean by this, it's not, hey, I have somebody who every Thursday they're going to export our projects to a hard drive. No, it needs to be fully automated. If people go on vacation, if systems go down, it doesn't matter. You need to have this fully automated in a policy setting. What I mean by this is you need to be able to say, I would like to take a backup every day, for example, and I would like to store this data here for this period of time. That is a policy-based backup. Assigning somebody to manually export is a single point of failure. It is not something we advise by any means, and especially if you are in financial services, healthcare, any of those industries, you are going to want automated backups. The other piece is you do not want those backups in the same systems in which you are using for production, and you definitely don't want it in a hard drive somewhere on your desk. You want a complete logical separation to a secure site. Back in the day, especially if you're on the IT side, everyone knew the 3-2-1 rule. Everyone knew it. It's 3 copies of data on 2 media types, 1 offsite. What that means is if something happens within your instance, if something happens to Atlassian, you have a backup that is completely decoupled and unaffected by whatever happened to your instance. This ensures that you have a safe place to recover from. And the other piece too is, especially if you are an organization with heavy M&A activity, you're leveraging tons of contractors. Insider threats are a real thing. They do happen. They're not always documented very publicly, but they do happen in many or more organizations than you think. And the way to protect yourself from this or any other external attacks is to leverage immutable backups. Tamper-proof backups, especially in the public cloud, right? You might hear the terminology like object lock. You want to make sure that those backups cannot be corrupted. Why? Well, if I'm a cyber criminal and I want to maximize what I am going to extort from you, I want to make sure that you have no way of recovering your data. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go and make sure that I can scan for where your backups are. And if I'm able to encrypt that or delete that, I have removed all of your leverage. So making sure the backup storage is tamper-proof is critical. The other piece is you really want to be careful about your strategy and how you recover data. What do I mean by that? Well, if there is critical assets or a critical page that was deleted and you need it very quickly, you do not want to require an entire import of a project or an entire import of an instance. You want to be able to make sure that you can restore the needle in the haystack, exactly what you have. And of course, you want to be able to make sure that you can actually test your ability to recover. If you build a backup service, if you leverage a backup service, a third party, and you've never tested the recovery, I will tell you that you do not have a backup service. You need to be able to restore that and prove it. And of course, even make sure that you have access to the data in case something does happen to a cloud system like Atlassian as well. So these are core best practices. We'll share this deck with you. You'll be able to leverage. We've built an entire checklist for you. Doesn't matter what you choose. This is here available to make sure that you're at least taking care of the fundamentals when it comes to data protection. Now, what you're going to find is Atlassian, of course, like every other platform, has to provide you with some basic functionality around data protection. So they allow you to export, they allow you to leverage their API. They have a open beta service called BRIE as well that gives you some backup functionality. But here are a few things that you want to think about. And if this makes sense for your organization, you definitely want to leverage a third-party backup tool, solution like HYCU. If you have very explicit off-site data retention requirements because you're in financial services or in healthcare, you want to consider a third party. If you need mandated access to this service and to this data, even if Atlassian goes down, you're going to want a third party backup. If you're not comfortable with waiting several hours or days to restore data, you need rapid granular restore. If your instance is massive, we encounter organizations with terabytes and terabytes of instances, petabytes in some cases. You need to make sure that you have a system that allows you to quickly back it up and to quickly restore so that you're not waiting weeks in order to get data back. If you have applications, especially in things like Jira Service Management, that customers are touching, and it has an impact on production system and customer experiences, you definitely need to leverage a third-party backup service. If you want to leverage that data for seeding, for other DR scenarios, you're going to need a third-party backup. And if you have multiple members of your team that need to be responsible for recovery or across departments, and you want to be safe from insider threats, we highly, highly recommend a third-party backup solution. Now, very quickly, before we move on to the data governance and data retention component, I'll tell you a little bit about HYCU. Our mission at HYCU is not simply to deliver backup and restore for Jira. Our mission at HYCU is to be the undo button for your entire organization. And that means being able to protect the Atlassian system of work, whether that's Jira, whether that's Confluence, product discovery, JSM, even marketplace plugins like Tempo timesheets. We're able to protect everything within the Atlassian ecosystem that holds critical data. And of course, all of the other tools that you use alongside Atlassian. So HYCU protects your production systems, even your virtual workloads, your file shares, but it also protects your Atlassian ecosystem and all of the tools and SaaS applications that you use as part of your technology stack. And it's part of a single platform and a single view for you to be able to back up, restore, recover, and manage all of the workloads in your organization. This is not a single tool for a single application. This is a platform that you can depend on to protect your data, no matter the size, no matter the scale, no matter the application. But most importantly, what I meant, because we're having such a compliance-focused conversation, is, well, where's that data going? The one thing that I want to make very clear is you should have sole control of your data. Another vendor should not be able to go in and look at your backups and examine. You want to be able to have full control. So think of HYCU as an express highway for those applications. So whether your organization uses Amazon S3, Google Cloud, Azure, things like Wasabi, or even on-prem S3 compatible storage targets, HYCU will send your backups there. Data is going to be fully encrypted. It's not going to be stored or accessed by HYCU. You control the sovereignty, you control the location, you control the networking, and of course, you can control how long you want to store that data, what kind of storage tier, and you can, of course, enable immutability. The entire point is you're most likely an application owner now managing backups. Your job should not be a backup administrator. It should be focused on driving business innovation and making sure that your Atlassian tooling is used in the organization. HYCU will automate everything, but give you enterprise class data resilience and recovery across the board. Now, that's the backup, recovery, and long-term data retention side of the house. But there's an entire other ecosystem on the data governance and retention side. So Nick, from your perspective, maybe help folks who aren't too close and maybe they're encountering this for the first time, like help them understand this concept of data governance and data retention, and then we'll actually discuss what they need to look out for.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Andy. So Andy's given us a great tour of the background requirements that lead us neatly into data protection. And similarly, we have a focus on data retention as part of a same sort of step of overall information governance for your Atlassian environment. Now, we're a slightly smaller company. We started just last year, and so we are currently a tool that focuses on data retention for your Atlassian estate. But our mission at Opus Guard is to simplify information governance for all SaaS tools as well. So much like HYCU, we're marching in the direction of being able to be the central retention platform that allows you to do everything I'm going to talk about in the next couple of minutes. Now, because Andy, you went through a lot of the background in great detail here, I don't need to cover a lot of those grounds again, but there are some similarities here. And so we have a very similar slide, and fancy that. when to think about data retention for your Atlassian SaaS estate? Well, there's a few key things. For example, you might have compliance pressures that are mounting around the need to demonstrate ISO 27001 or SOC 2, or potentially comply with some industry regulations under which your company operates. For example, if you're in financial or healthcare or something similar. You might have an audit or a recertification or some kind of a renewal looming around that stuff. And that might be an inflection point for you to think about data retention as you start to get a handle on how much of it you've created across your estate. So speaking of that, you may also be looking at your Atlassian sites growing somewhat unruly. I mean, Andy just mentioned terabytes and petabytes in some cases in large instances. That slows the performance down and brings a lot of information to the forefront, especially when some newer techniques of retrieving it are being employed, which we'll get onto in a second. You might also be finding that your backup storage costs are climbing too rapidly because you're keeping 3 copies of that backup somewhere. And guess what? Every bit of object storage you're able to reduce is a direct cost savings that your CFO may be interested in. So let's say even just 20% of your content in your Atlassian site is beyond the retention policy of your organization. I don't know of any CRO who's going to sneeze or turn down a 20% savings on object storage if they can get it relatively easily. This is a big one. If you're looking at internal AI or turning on Rovo and you're trying to wring value out of it, it's usually a good signal when interesting and weird answers start to come up because you've actually fed the entirety of your corporate memory into Rovo and into your internal AI pilots. And we're seeing plenty of reports coming out now from MIT and from Atlassian themselves saying that over 90% of AI pilots right now are failing to deliver real ROI on the money being spent. And in large part, it's because the answers that they're generating are just a little bit strange. And that can be due to cognitive decline or model drift, or what's also now being called brain rot in the LLM, if all the wrong old content is being fed in for the use case that you're trying to deal with. You might be looking at a step change in your maturity model around governance for your organization in general. And so this would be a life cycle sort of focus, going from being focused on just backup and restore when needed across to the overall governance of life cycle of information in all of those systems. And that might even also collide or dovetail nicely with a strategic inflection in how you're adopting Atlassian SaaS tooling across your company. Obviously, if you're a large enterprise with a big data center estate, you've probably done that already, but you could be a company growing into your use of Atlassian as your company is maturing as well. And so it's becoming a more strategic part of your business, and the information within it should be governed in all the right ways, including how long it gets retained. So let's move on, Andy. So then at Opus Guard, we built a series of applications here, starting with a focus on your Atlassian SaaS estate to help you solve those kinds of problems quickly and effectively. So first up, Content Retention Manager allows you to delegate retention policies to the right people who are trained and given that responsibility across your organization. Much like Andy said, now you're an application admin. Should you be focusing on backup admin? Now you're an application admin for the Atlassian estate. Should you really be trying to figure out how long every single piece of content in it lives? No, you shouldn't. The organization's retention policy and the people who know their content best are there to do that. So Content Retention Manager allows you to delegate which folks are in those groups. It then gives them a dashboard and a deeper content audit to allow them to model and see what's there, what's inside the policy, why, and what's outside the policy and how old it is and what the exposure potentially looks like. It also allows you to create a limitless hierarchy of different policy-based rules that are then dynamically intersected with data classifications to determine how long a piece of content needs to live for. That should all be directed by your organization's retention policy, of course, but we give you a lot of flexibility in how you apply those. And those are then made routine, fully automated, and can optionally completely remove the content all the way through eventually to the backup. When the backup is taken again the next time, that piece of content is gone, and however long you're retaining the prior backup for it then takes over as the final life cycle of that piece of content. Now, all of that's wonderful, but you can't really be compliant with things like external industry regulators or prove quickly to your auditors that you're following framework guidelines if you don't have an audit trail that explains what you did and why. And so obviously a tool that does this job of content retention management across your SaaS application estate needs to give you an immutable audit trail that no one can change, but they can search and export to prove things like defensible deletion during an audit or during an e-discovery motion when opposing counsel queries why a certain piece of content's not part of the produced set. So Andy, on the next slide, I think we are talking just a little bit then about the native approach to doing those things today. And this is kind of building on the shared responsibility model and its matrix across to then what happens if you employ tooling like Content Retention Manager. And so the first sort of look at this is like, you have an approach to this problem. Today, a lot of people are just doing it in an ad hoc fashion, giving too many users access to administrative tooling that is usually standalone and given to you directly by each application. In the Atlassian case, it's Content Manager for Confluence and Site Optimizer for Jira. But they don't have very fine-grained controls. There's not a great deal of centralized auditing. There's some. And there isn't any routinized, automated management of the lifecycle of content using that sort of approach. Again, for coverage, you have some inconsistencies because you didn't have a policy being affected. You're down to users making decisions and doing things that they care to choose to do. So maybe they're deleting pages, maybe they're archiving. Turns out those things hang around in the system and they're discoverable in future anyway. And so a tool like Content Retention Manager will give you more complete coverage of all of those affairs and just make sure that you're actually taking care of what needs to be taken care of across the board. In terms of compliance, then, if you're doing it manually and you're sending an email reminder to 17 people across the company to take care of deleting information in their business unit once every 6 months, it's really hard to prove that that's actually compliant with things like FINRA or DORA regulations. And so things like Retention Manager allow you to map what you're doing across to frameworks such as ISO and SOC 2, GDPR, and the financial industry regulations much more easily. Now, when it comes to controls, you've got, with native approaches, relatively limited visibility and relatively limited enforcement of what happens. And so moving across to automating and using a policy-down, policy-driven approach gets you into a state where you've got delegated administration of the retention job, you've got a full audit trail, you've got complete classification of the data if you need it and want it, and you've got review workflows that might even be driven by those data classifications, say in high-value data classification use cases. In terms of then hygiene, the easiest thing to do today is kind of ignore the problem, kick the can down the road and worry about it later. We're protected. We've got the backup orchestrated into 3 copies in 2 different places, and HYCU's handling that for us. No more problems. But the reality is, if you employ continuous cleanup as an approach, you just end up with a lower risk and smaller footprint overall, which then leads you to a better AI-ready state of all of the context of your corporate knowledge. Again, feeding in bad information into your internal LLMs can result, or at least can risk, what's called cognitive decline in those models. And there's new research papers coming out just recently suggesting that that can actually be long-lasting decline. And so entire retraining and restart of AI projects might have to happen. And so just making sure that you're paying attention to hygiene on a regular, routinized and automated basis makes a lot of sense. And so if that's the case, you get just better outcomes. There's less users making errors, there's less time by people spent doing the job, and there's better trust, better proof, better automation of governance, and greater efficiency across the board, including your AI strategy. So that's a little bit about Opus Guard and Content Retention Manager in the same kind of context. Andy, we've got a couple of things that we want to say about why people should trust Opus Guard. Much in the same way as you explained about HYCU, we realize that companies who care about their information and about their governance stance are going to be the companies interested in doing this today. And so we have built our applications for the most secure enterprise. We're backed by Atlassian Ventures. Our applications run only on Atlassian. There is zero infrastructure that we host, and we have zero egress of your data over to Opus Guard. We only get 2 things, the name and the email address of the marketplace billing contact and the marketplace technical contact, and that's it. All that information is hosted on Atlassian within the context of your Atlassian sites. So it also means that it's already data residency or sovereignty compliant. and our applications will be pinned to your site and data realms. So what I'm saying is everything stays within the context of your Atlassian sites. And if you think back to that shared responsibility matrix, the identities of users and services and applications within that environment that are allowed to see your data belong within your control as well. That said, we realize that you're going to want to understand that Opus Guard takes the right approach. And so we are SOC 2 Type 2 certified with our attestation on file in our Trust Center. And of course, our applications are fully available on the Atlassian marketplace. So my last message for you today is that if this has sparked any interest in your mind, on the next slide, you can see how you can start to do something about that. We would ask you to just consider trying Content Retention Manager and modeling what information you have in your Atlassian site, which will also help you understand what to do when you're engaging with HYCU as well.
No, Nick, that's very well put. For those who are interested, I'm going to leave this on here for you to be able to search for this. But I think there are a lot of parallels between our discussion. And a lot of folks here, thought they had a couple more years on data center, Nick, and that's not the case anymore. So there's a lot of, I don't want to say procrastination, and I don't want to say rushed migrations, but the timelines have accelerated, which means that mistakes can be made. And the first mistake and the most important thing that you walk away with today is you have to really understand what you're responsible for. The last thing that you want to do is have any surprises where you're already running in cloud and you have a specific incident or you fall for the usual mistakes. So having an awareness of what you're responsible for and reading the shared responsibility model is already a massive step towards landing very safely in the cloud. But then you have a business decision to make. You have a resilience decision and a governance decision to make, which is, am I going to leverage some tooling that's available to me, spend time, resources, people, and energy on making sure that that tooling works to meet 20 to 30% of my use case, or do I want to leverage third-party tools that automate all of this for me, whether it's HYCU with data protection, or even Opus Guard on the content retention side within Confluence and other services. And Nick, the other piece though that's very important though is Atlassian is a component of your tech stack. You have these same responsibilities across every other workload. And the majority of the people that are now going to be responsible for that restore, it's not the virtual backup administrator in the data center. It's going to be an application owner. You don't have the time, you don't have the resources to dedicate this level of DIY across the. So take a look at also evaluating where do I fill in third-party tools to make sure that my data is retained effectively, that it's protected, and that it is recoverable. So you can go and look at Content Retention Manager within the Atlassian Marketplace. HYCU is also available in the Atlassian Marketplace, but I would ask you to scan this QR code and actually click through the experience and see how if you or when you move to the cloud, you actually gain functionality. You can go and you can restore an attachment, you can restore an asset, an automation, you can protect things as you see fit without any real limits. So scan this QR code, take a look at our product tour as well. But ultimately, just by joining this webinar, you've taken the right step in the right direction, because you have shown that there are capabilities that you need to make sure that are set out within your cloud migration, and we congratulate you for that. If you have any questions, we'll make sure to email you with a response, whether it's on the Opus Guard side or on the HYCU side. But Nick, I want to thank you for your time. I've personally learned a lot, especially, I never thought I'd hear the terminology brain rot in the context of content retention, but it was extremely valuable, and we really appreciate your insights as well.
Andy, thank you again for the opportunity, and we're glad to be here helping solve these problems together for our customers.
Thanks, Nick, and everybody else. Thank you for your time and attention today. We hope you have a great day.